The morning started like any other, until a heart-stopping moment unfolded on a quiet suburban street. A garbage truck rumbled through the neighborhood, its usual routine interrupted by the desperate cries of a little girl waving her arms frantically. Drivers slowed, neighbors peeked from their windows, and the truck came to an abrupt halt. Something was wrong, and her tears said it all. What could possibly be so urgent? Within moments, the police arrived, and the scene turned into one of courage, compassion, and unexpected twists. Stay with us as we uncover the incredible story behind this emotional plea for help. As the garbage truck came to a sudden halt, the air felt thick with confusion and concern. The usual hum of daily life seemed to pause, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, unsure of what to make of the sight before them. A small girl, no older than 6, stood in the middle of the street, her face streaked with tears. She was shaking, her hands trembling as they reached out toward the truck. Her eyes were wide with fear, her voice a raw cry for help that echoed through the stillness. It was the kind of desperate sound that no one could ignore. The garbage truck driver, a man who had been making his rounds for years, was the first to react. He slammed on the brakes, his heart racing as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He had seen many things during his long shifts: stray dogs, forgotten toys, even the occasional lost cat, but never a child so distressed. He leaned forward, staring at her, unsure whether to step out of the truck or keep his distance. The last thing he wanted was to make things worse. Across the street, a woman who had been walking her dog froze in place. Her initial instinct was to rush over and help, but something about the situation gave her pause. There was something unsettling in the girl's frantic movements, something that didn't sit right. The woman instinctively reached for her phone, dialing the police. The call was short, but urgent. "I think there's something wrong. A little girl, she's in trouble, and she needs help. Hurry." Meanwhile, the girl's sobs grew louder, more intense. She pointed toward the alleyway, her small finger trembling as she directed the driver's attention. He squinted, trying to see what she was so urgently indicating, but all he could see was the end of the alley, dim and empty. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he realized that whatever she was trying to say, it wasn't something that could be understood in a moment's glance. Neighbors had begun to gather, murmuring amongst themselves. A few had stepped out of their houses, drawn by the girl's cries and the peculiar scene unfolding on their street. An older man, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, was one of the first to approach the little girl. His face was soft, lined with years of wisdom, but his eyes held a mixture of curiosity and concern. Kneeling down to her level, he gently asked, "Hey, sweetheart, what's going on? Are you okay?" The little girl didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked around as though expecting something, or someone, to appear. Her eyes darted nervously toward the alleyway again, and she clutched the man's hand, shaking her head. "He's gone," she whispered, almost inaudibly. The man frowned, his brow furrowed with confusion. "Who's gone?" he asked gently, but the girl seemed to shut down, her eyes filled with more fear than he had ever seen in a child. She pressed her small palms against her ears, as if trying to block out the world around her. In that moment, the sirens of a police car pierced the air, signaling that help was on its way. But even as the car screeched to a halt, the tension remained thick. The officers, a male and female team, jumped out of the vehicle, immediately assessing the situation. They had seen emergencies of all kinds during their careers, but this was different. There was no immediate danger, no clear threat, and yet there was something terribly wrong. "Ma'am," the female officer said to the woman who had called them, "what's going on? What did you see?" The woman's voice trembled as she explained, "I don't know, but that little girl, she's terrified. I just thought something wasn't right. She's alone in the street, and she keeps pointing to the alley like she's seen something. I don't know." The officers exchanged a glance, their instincts kicking in. The male officer crouched down next to the little girl, speaking in soft tones to avoid frightening her further. "Hey, sweetie," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm Officer Hayes, and this is my partner, Officer Cruz. We're here to help. Can you tell us what's going on? What happened?" The girl's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of recognition, a glimmer of trust. Then, just as quickly, the fear returned, and she looked away, her hands covering her face. Officer Hayes looked to Officer Cruz, who was scanning the area. They were getting nowhere with the girl, but what was more unsettling was that the people who had gathered around were just as confused. No one had seen anything unusual. No one could make sense of why the child was so shaken. The police, sensing the urgency, decided to take action. Officer Hayes turned to the garbage truck driver. "We need to block off the street, keep the area clear while we investigate." The truck driver, though still visibly rattled, nodded and began to maneuver the truck to create a barrier. Meanwhile, Officer Cruz pulled out a notepad and began asking the neighbors if they had seen anything unusual, anything out of the ordinary in the last few hours. But as the investigation continued, it became clear that there was nothing in the immediate vicinity that could explain the girl's distress. No signs of a struggle, no trace of another person. It was as though the child had been left there, alone, with no explanation for why she was so terrified. Then, as the officers gathered to discuss their next steps, the little girl spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "He came for me," she said, her words barely audible. "He said I had to come with him." The silence that followed was palpable. Officer Hayes exchanged a concerned look with his partner, both of them suddenly realizing that they were dealing with something far more serious than they had anticipated. There was no clarity yet, but one thing was becoming increasingly apparent. The girl wasn't just scared, she was in danger. And whoever had been after her was still out there. The mystery deepened with every passing second. Who was this mysterious figure she spoke of? And why had she been left alone in the street? Was this just the beginning of something far darker? The answers seemed to be slipping just out of reach, leaving everyone on edge, uncertain of what would happen next. The girl's words hung in the air, heavy and unnerving. Officer Hayes knelt closer, trying to decipher her cryptic statement. "Who came for you, sweetie? Who was it?" he asked gently, but the girl only shook her head, her wide eyes darting nervously toward the alley again. Something about that alley seemed to hold a strange allure for her, something that made her too scared to even speak further. A chill ran down Hayes' spine. "He said I had to come with him," the girl repeated, her voice trembling. "He's waiting." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Cruz frowned. Could it be a kidnapper? Or someone trying to lure her in? Before Hayes could respond, the sounds of distant chatter and movement from the gathered crowd grew louder. The neighbors had started to talk amongst themselves, each of them offering their own theories, but none of them made sense. Some suggested that maybe it was an imaginary friend or a wild fantasy of a scared child, while others thought it could be a neighbor who had been acting strangely. But there was no concrete answer, no clear suspect. Meanwhile, a soft wind began to stir the trees lining the street. The sense of calm that had briefly settled over the neighborhood evaporated, replaced by a rising sense of tension. The little girl's terrified demeanor seemed to spread like a contagion. Even the calmest among the neighbors were beginning to feel unsettled. Who could have done something so sinister, and why would they target a child so young? As the officers discussed their next steps, the man who had tried to comfort the girl earlier approached Hayes. He was visibly distressed, wiping his hands on his trousers. "You know, I've been living here for years, and there's something off about this whole situation," he said. His voice was low, as though he didn't want to alarm anyone further. "A couple of weeks ago, I saw a van parked down by the alley. It was strange because it wasn't a delivery van or anything, just a plain, white van with tinted windows. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now that I'm seeing this, I don't know, it just feels wrong." Hayes nodded, his mind whirring. A white van. It wasn't much to go on, but it was the first lead they had. "Thank you, sir. We'll look into it," he said, his voice steady, but his thoughts already moving in 100 different directions. Cruz stepped aside to make a call to the station, requesting any reports of a white van in the area. Meanwhile, Hayes turned back to the girl, who was still clutching her hands to her ears, her face pinched in fear. He didn't want to push her too much, but he needed to know more. There was too much at stake. "Sweetheart, listen to me," he said softly. "I know you're scared, but we need your help. Can you tell me if you saw anything else? Anything that could help us find out who's been bothering you?" The girl looked at him then, her eyes wide and pleading. "He was tall," she whispered. "I think he wore a mask." A mask? Hayes' stomach churned. Whoever this person was, they were taking precautions, making sure they weren't seen. Was this just a random encounter, or was there something deeper going on? And how was the little girl involved? Cruz returned to the scene, his face grim. "Nothing on the van yet. It's like it disappeared into thin air. But there's something strange. We've had a few reports of people seeing masked individuals lurking around neighborhoods lately. Not a lot of details, but it's been enough to raise some concerns. It could be connected to this." The plot was thickening, and with each new piece of information, the mystery grew. Hayes rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "So this isn't an isolated case?" Cruz nodded. "Seems like it. We might be dealing with something bigger than we thought." Meanwhile, the girl's sobbing began to subside, but she still wouldn't release her grip on Hayes' hand. She looked up at him with desperate eyes, as though trying to communicate something without words. It was clear she wasn't ready to leave the safety of the officer's presence. As much as Hayes wanted to reassure her, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were all in greater danger than they realized. Something wasn't right, and they were running out of time to figure it out. Back at the alleyway, the air seemed to hold a sinister quality. The shadows there were thick, cloaking the narrow path that led behind the row of houses. No one had ventured down that alley since the girl had first pointed toward it, but its dark presence felt like it was waiting, watching. A few of the more curious neighbors had ventured closer, but none dared to step into the alley itself. They stood just at the edge, peering into the gloom. Everyone in the street had become aware of the growing unease, but no one knew how to stop it. The sense of foreboding was like a tangible thing hanging in the air. A few minutes later, another officer arrived on the scene, Officer Martinez, who had been following up on other calls in the area. She took one look at the girl's wide, panicked eyes and immediately went into action, coordinating with Hayes and Cruz to take the investigation to the next level. "We're going to need to search that alley. If there's something there, anything, we need to find it," she said, determination in her voice. The three officers slowly began to approach the alleyway, their footsteps deliberate and cautious. As they reached the entrance, they paused, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The hairs on the back of Hayes' neck prickled as he motioned for the others to follow. The alley was eerily silent. No signs of anyone hiding, no strange noises or movement. It almost seemed too quiet, as if the world itself had decided to hold its breath in anticipation. But something about it made Hayes' instincts scream. They couldn't be sure, but they had to look. As they ventured deeper, the sense of dread grew. Something was waiting, he could feel it. But the question was, what? The alleyway grew narrower as the officers ventured further, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Every step they took seemed to echo louder than the last, a sound that felt too unnatural in the thick silence. The air had grown cooler, the shadows more oppressive, as if the world outside the alley no longer existed. It was just them and the unknown. Officer Hayes' grip on his flashlight tightened. His gut told him they were walking into something they wouldn't be able to easily get out of. Something about this entire situation felt wrong, like they were being led into a trap. But he couldn't afford to back down now, not when a little girl was terrified and the unknown menace was still lurking in the background. Behind him, Officer Cruz was scanning the walls of the alley, his eyes sharp for any sign of movement or hidden clues. Martinez, always the level-headed one, moved cautiously, her gaze fixed on the dark corners ahead. The alley was unnaturally quiet. Not a rustle, not a sound from the street, just the oppressive quiet of this narrow, forgotten space. The further they went, the more the sense of dread grew. The hairs on the back of Hayes' neck stood on end. He paused, holding up his hand to signal the others to stop. There, in the shadows just ahead, was someone, standing motionless. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The officer's breath hitched, and the beam of Hayes' flashlight locked onto a figure in the distance. Tall, cloaked in darkness, its silhouette rigid and still, it was the figure the girl had been so afraid of. "Stay back," Hayes whispered, his voice a strained whisper of command. The officers instinctively took a step back, tension radiating between them. He could feel the weight of the situation, as though the figure had been waiting for them to enter its domain. This was no coincidence. Whoever or whatever it was had been watching them, watching the girl, and now they were here. "Who are you?" Hayes demanded, his voice louder now, gaining strength. The figure didn't move, didn't answer, but the air seemed to shift. The weight in the alley thickened, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Cruz, ever the pragmatic one, reached for his radio, but Hayes quickly held out a hand, signaling him to hold off. There was something in the air that warned him not to draw attention just yet. The silence stretched, heavy with the possibility of violence. And then it happened, something so quick and so sudden that it took everyone by surprise. The figure in the shadows lunged, but not at them. It turned and bolted deeper into the alley, its movements fast and fluid. Without a word, Hayes broke into a sprint, shouting for the others to follow. His pulse hammered in his chest as his boots pounded against the damp ground. There was no time to think, no time to plan. This was a chase, and he couldn't afford to lose the figure now. The alley twisted and turned, the darkness wrapping around them like a maze. The figure was fast, too fast. They were getting closer, but not close enough. Hayes' mind raced as he tried to make sense of it. Who was this person? What did they want with the girl? And why were they so determined to avoid being caught? Martinez was close behind him, her breaths sharp and labored. Cruz was trailing slightly behind, but Hayes knew he had to keep up the pace. Every second counted. Then, without warning, the figure rounded a corner and disappeared. Hayes skidded to a halt, barely avoiding crashing into the brick wall of the alley. He paused, eyes scanning every inch of the space. Nothing. The silence felt suffocating, as though the world had just closed its doors on them. The figure had vanished into thin air, just like the van the neighbors had seen. Hayes' heart raced. They couldn't lose him. Whatever they had been chasing, it was now more dangerous than ever. He turned to the others, his mind racing for a plan. "Split up," he ordered. "Check every corner. We can't let him get away again." As they moved to search, the tension reached its peak. Every rustling sound felt like an enemy, every shadow, a potential threat. They crept forward, flashlights sweeping the ground. Every step was a question, every moment a gamble. Meanwhile, back at the street, the girl remained at the scene, still held by a group of concerned neighbors and officers. She was watching the alley, her expression as tense as ever. She knew something they didn't. She had seen this person before, had seen them in the shadows, had heard their voice. Her gut told her this wasn't over. But as the minutes ticked by, she seemed to be growing more anxious. Her hands gripped her arms tightly, her eyes darting between the alley and the officers who were still looking for clues. Was he still out there? Had he gotten away for good? Suddenly, a sound cut through the tension, a faint scratching noise, like metal against stone. The officers froze, each of them alert. From the corner of the alley, the faint outline of the figure appeared once more, but this time it wasn't moving. No, it was watching them. Hayes' heart lurched. His instincts screamed that they were being set up, but the game was far from over. He motioned for the others to stop, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. The figure had stopped running, but why? A whisper of movement, and Hayes' flashlight flicked toward the wall where a narrow door had just creaked open. The figure stepped back inside. "Wait," Hayes muttered, His voice was low, but the words felt heavy with the weight of realization. It's a trap. The officers exchanged urgent glances. They had been too focused on the chase, too consumed by the idea of catching the figure. But now, they realized they had missed something crucial, something right in front of them. Something was hidden, something waiting for them to make a mistake. The question wasn't just who they were chasing anymore, it was what had they walked into. As Hayes motioned for his team to hold back, a sharp, almost imperceptible sound caught his attention, the soft click of a lock turning. He froze, his eyes widening in realization. The figure hadn't just stepped back inside a door. They had deliberately lured them to this very spot, guiding them into an unexpected corner of the alley. This wasn't just a chase. It was part of a much larger, more sinister game. Before anyone could react, the alley around them seemed to shift. The darkness deepened, stretching further than it should, and a strange, almost mechanical hum filled the air. Hayes' instincts flared. Something was off, terribly off. He signaled for the others to move closer, his voice barely a whisper now. "We need to get out of here. It's not what we think." As he spoke, a distant noise echoed, louder this time. A low, growling rumble that sent chills down his spine. It wasn't the sound of a car, or even the typical hum of city life. No, this was something else, something far more ominous. A sudden flash of movement caught his eye. A shadow darted across the alley entrance. Another figure. But this one wasn't cloaked in darkness. It was illuminated by the stark light from their flashlights. For a brief moment, Hayes caught a glimpse of a face. Pale, almost unnaturally so, with eyes that seemed hollow. The figure was standing, waiting, as if expecting them. Then it disappeared into the blackness as quickly as it had appeared. "Get back," Cruz shouted, pulling Martinez by the arm, but it was already too late. A blinding light suddenly flashed from one of the side walls of the alley. It wasn't a flash of a camera or any light they were familiar with. This was something far stronger, something that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. It blinded them, forcing them to shield their eyes as it flared for several long seconds. The light flickered out as suddenly as it had come, and the officers blinked in disbelief. The alley had completely changed. What had once been an ordinary, run-of-the-mill stretch of road now felt like something from a nightmare. The walls were adorned with strange symbols, markings that Hayes had never seen before. They weren't just graffiti, they looked deliberate, as if they had been placed with intent. But by who? And why? "This doesn't make sense," Martinez muttered, her voice trembling as she glanced around. "Where are we? This wasn't here before. These markings, this is no ordinary alley." Cruz's hand hovered over his weapon, but he didn't draw it. His instincts were telling him that something far more dangerous than a suspect was at play. "I don't think we're supposed to be here," he said, his voice tight. "Something's pulling us in, and it's not just that figure." As they moved cautiously, trying to make sense of the bizarre transformation around them, Hayes' mind raced. The earlier events were starting to line up. This wasn't a simple case of a missing child or a random figure on the run. This was orchestrated. Someone had set all of this in motion, and they were trying to trap them, to lead them into a deeper, darker conspiracy. And then from behind them, the sound of footsteps, a slow, deliberate pace. They weren't alone anymore. Hayes turned to face the sound, his heart hammering. His flashlight swept through the darkness, but it revealed nothing. The figure from earlier was still gone, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The air seemed to press against them, thick with something unseen. That's when he heard it, the unmistakable guttural growl. Closer this time, and unmistakably human. "Get ready," Hayes said, voice barely audible as he signaled to the others. He knew they were out of their depth, walking into something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. But what were they dealing with? What could cause a grown man to be so terrified, to run into the unknown with such desperation? Then a voice, faint at first, but then clearer, chilling them to their bones. "You shouldn't have come here." The words hung in the air, each syllable weighted with a strange power. The officers froze, a cold sweat prickling down their spines. It wasn't the voice of the figure they had been chasing. It was something older, deeper, more menacing. The type of voice that would haunt someone long after the encounter ended. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to vibrate. A low hum pulsed from somewhere deep in the alley. Then, a high-pitched whine filled the air, making their ears ring. Martinez's hand flew to her head, as though trying to block the noise. It felt like something was pulling at them, drawing them toward the dark corners of the alley. "Move," Hayes barked, his voice cracking through the chaos. But as they tried to make their way back, something stopped them. The alley entrance had vanished. In its place stood an impenetrable wall, smooth and solid as stone. No escape, no exit. They were trapped. A muffled sound reached their ears, almost like a door creaking open. Then from the darkness ahead came a figure, but this one was different. No longer was it a silhouette in the shadows. This time they saw the figure clearly, a man or something resembling one. He wore a long, flowing coat, the fabric dark and tattered, moving in ways that defied logic. But it wasn't his appearance that made them freeze in terror. It was the eyes, hollow, black, and endless, like two pits staring into the deepest recesses of their souls. "Did you really think you could stop it?" the figure whispered. His voice was deep, distant, almost as if it was coming from somewhere far beyond the alley. The officers stood paralyzed, the weight of the realization sinking in. Whatever this was, it was far beyond a mere criminal chase. This was something ancient, something powerful, and they were caught in its web. The girls' cries echoed in their minds. Had they been brought here to serve as pawns in something far darker than they could comprehend? The danger wasn't just the figure. It was what lay beneath, hidden in the very fabric of this twisted place. And whatever it was, they were now in its grasp. "Run," Hayes shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the noise that now filled the alley. The hum, the whispers, the growl, all of it collided into a cacophony of terror. But there was nowhere to go. The walls, the figures, the shadows, they were all closing in. And just like that, the trap had snapped shut. The figure stood before them, his presence like an oppressive storm cloud that threatened to engulf them all. The hum in the alley grew louder, reverberating through their bones, making it harder to think, to breathe. Hayes felt a bead of cold sweat drip down his temple as the shadowed figure took a step forward, the walls around them seeming to contract with every movement. The weight of the situation, the mystery that had consumed them, pressed down like an anchor, suffocating them. "What do you want?" Hayes forced out, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to remain steady. His flashlight flickered weakly in the oppressive darkness, casting eerie, fractured beams that did little to pierce the thickening blackness. The figure did not answer right away. He merely tilted his head, a slight, unsettling smile spreading across his face. His hollow, dark eyes locked onto Hayes, as though he could see straight into his soul. "Did you think you could stop it?" The voice was low, almost musical, laced with a chilling finality. "You're too late." With a sharp motion, the figure raised his hand, and suddenly the ground beneath them trembled. It wasn't an earthquake, but something much more unnatural. The alley began to shift, warping before their eyes. The walls seemed to bend, as if the very fabric of reality was being twisted. Hayes could feel the grip of terror seizing his chest, his heart pounding like a drum in his ears. Then, everything went still. The figure dropped his hand to his side, and for the briefest moment, Hayes thought it was over, that they were done, that this was where their story ended. But the silence was more suffocating than any sound. It was as if the world had stopped, and nothing could move again. Cruz, still tense but resolute, stepped forward, his voice shaking but determined. "We're not backing down. Whatever this is, whatever you're part of, it ends now." The figure let out a slow, hollow laugh, and that was when the true horror of the situation hit them. The alley had changed again, but this time, it was beyond what any of them could have imagined. What had once been a simple street had morphed into a twisted, otherworldly space. There were no doors, no windows, only endless walls of stone covered in those same cryptic symbols the officers had seen earlier. And then, like a dark wave crashing down, everything they thought they understood shattered. From the corner of the alley, the girl appeared again, but she wasn't the same. Her wide, terrified eyes were now empty, vacant, as though she was no longer herself. She walked slowly toward them, her steps deliberate. No longer was she a frightened child. Now she was the embodiment of something else, something powerful. "You were never meant to save her," the figure said, his voice suddenly soft, almost pitying. "She is the key." Hayes' blood ran cold. The girl, she was the key to what? What did this all mean? But before he could ask, the girl's voice, quiet and strained, cut through the air. "I didn't want to. I didn't want to be the key." The officers stared in disbelief. The girl, the one they'd been trying to protect, the one they'd been chasing shadows for, had somehow become a part of this twisted game. She was bound to it, linked to whatever dark force had overtaken the alley. She hadn't been the victim at all. "No," Hayes whispered, his mind struggling to catch up with the reality that was unfolding before him. "No, this can't be right." The girl stepped forward, her small frame moving with unnatural precision, and as she did, the figure beside her extended his hand, beckoning her forward. The moment she took it, the alley erupted with an almost deafening roar. The walls cracked open, revealing a blinding light that seemed to stretch beyond time itself. The ground beneath them rumbled, and in that instant, Hayes felt as though the very fabric of their world was tearing apart. Everything seemed to freeze in place, and then everything collapsed. Hayes' world went black. When he awoke, he was lying on the ground in the alley, the blinding light gone, the hum silenced. The once twisted, distorted alleyway had returned to its ordinary form. The air was still and calm. The street was normal again, as though none of the nightmare had ever happened. But he could feel it, the weight of something lingering in the air. It wasn't over. Cruz and Martinez were already on their feet, their eyes scanning the scene around them in confusion. The girl was nowhere to be seen. The figure, the one who had been orchestrating the entire nightmare, had vanished without a trace. Hayes stood up disoriented. His heart was still racing, but there was no sign of the darkness, no sign of the haunting presence that had threatened to swallow them. It was as if it had all been a bad dream. But as he looked around, something caught his eye. On the side of the alley, etched into the wall in fresh, glowing light, were more of the cryptic symbols. They were now even more intricate, more detailed, and somehow alive. They pulsed faintly, as though they were breathing. A sudden chill ran down his spine. Behind him, Croz's voice cut through the stillness. "Hayes, look at this." Hayes turned, and for a moment, he couldn't believe his eyes. In the middle of the street, standing in plain view, was the white van. The same van that had been seen weeks ago by the neighbors. The van that had once vanished without a trace. It was now parked directly in front of them, and in the back window, a single dark figure stared back at them. The figure smiled. "Your fight isn't over," it said, its voice distant and echoing. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the van drove off, disappearing around the corner. But this time, there was no chase, no pursuit. The mystery had taken on an even darker turn, and Hayes realized with a chilling certainty that whatever force they had encountered in that alley, it was only just beginning. There was no escaping it. Not yet. As the van disappeared into the night, Hayes stood frozen, his mind reeling. The alley was quiet now, almost too quiet, but the strange symbols still pulsed faintly on the wall. Whatever dark force they had uncovered wasn't done with them, it was only just beginning. The girl, the figure, the van, they were all pieces of a much larger, sinister puzzle. Hayes knew they couldn't walk away, not until they had answers. But he also knew one thing: some mysteries weren't meant to be solved easily. The real fight was only just starting, and it would haunt them for a long time.